let's talk about something that feels small, but changes everything. Silence. In a world obsessed with shouting opinions, being first to speak, dominating conversations, what if the real power came from holding back? Socrates knew this. He didn't win arguments by talking over people. He won by waiting, listening, and then asking one question that unraveled everything. And in today's noisy world, where people talk to prove themselves, your silence might just be your sharpest weapon. In this video, we're going to uncover why silence is more than just the absence of words, why it's a form of control, of presence, of power. You'll learn how Socrates used silence to disarm his opponents, and how you can use the same principle in meetings, in arguments, even online, to win without ever raising your voice. And at the end, I'll share one timeless Socratic trick that flips every confrontation in your favor. Silence is rarely just the absence of words. It is presence, magnified. And for many, that presence becomes unbearable. We are so used to performing, so conditioned to prove our worth through sound and motion, that when a moment stretches without speech, it feels like something is breaking. But what's breaking isn't the moment. It's the mask. The silence strips away the buffer between who we are and what we fear being seen as. It reveals the hidden tremble in those who need to dominate the air to feel visible, who speak not to connect, but to distract from themselves. Socrates understood this instinct. He recognized that most people do not speak from understanding, but from discomfort. And so he let them. He gave them the rope, not to trap them, but to let them walk themselves into their own contradiction. He didn't interrupt. He didn't compete. He simply waited until the words began to contradict themselves, until the speaker's confidence dissolved into explanation after explanation. Then, with perfect timing and no malice, he would ask, "And how do you know this to be true?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a mirror. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It asked more than words ever could. It shifted the weight of proof. In that stillness, Socrates claimed the real power, not by raising his voice, but by anchoring his presence so deeply that the room moved around him. His silence didn't create discomfort. It revealed the discomfort that was already there. And when used with wisdom, your silence can do the same. Most of the world today runs on reaction. The faster you respond, the stronger you seem. But strength isn't speed, it's direction. And when someone challenges you, whether it's your boss in a meeting or a stranger online, the real test isn't about proving yourself. It's about deciding who gets to set the tone of the conversation. Most people, when confronted, fall into an old reflex. Defend, justify, retaliate. But when you pause instead, just pause, the script breaks. In that stillness, something unexpected happens. They begin to feel exposed. Not because you humiliated them, but because your silence gave them nothing to push against. No fuel for the fire, no mirror for their performance, just space. And in that space, they start questioning their own posture. Did they overstep? Did they misread the moment? This is how silence becomes influence, not through intimidation, but through restraint. And when you do choose to speak, you do not meet emotion with more emotion. You ask, not to corner, but to shift. Why do you say that? What makes you so sure? Is that your truth or someone else's? These aren't just questions. They are interruptions to the ego's rhythm. They invite reflection. They redirect the power dynamic from conflict to clarity. Now you're not reacting, you're leading. Not from above, not with force, but from a quiet position of control, like Socrates did, time and time again. Not to win the argument, but to bring the other person face to face with their own thinking. And once that happens, you've already won something far greater. There is a quiet kind of gravity that some people carry. You've felt it before. In a room of competing voices, one person says very little, yet commands more attention than all the noise combined. It isn't about volume or charisma. It's something deeper, a kind of inner stillness that pulls others in, not through force, but through presence. The world notices the one who doesn't rush to speak, because that person seems to know something the rest don't. They seem to belong to themselves. This is why people follow the still one, the one who doesn't flinch under pressure, who doesn't chase the spotlight or scramble to be right. They listen, they observe, and when they speak, it's not to impress, but to reveal. Their words land differently, heavier, more trusted, because those words weren't thrown out to fill silence. They were chosen, measured, earned. Socrates never shouted. He didn't need a podium or a crowd. He spoke in open courtyards, under the sun, surrounded by ordinary people. And yet, those moments became philosophy that outlived empires, not because he demanded to be followed, but because he showed what it looks like to be rooted. When someone is calm in the chaos, others instinctively gather around, not to be entertained, but to be grounded too, because in a world that is always reaching outward, there is something deeply magnetic about the one who turns inward and stands still. Silence is often mistaken for submission, but those who understand it know it as a form of mastery. It is not the absence of action, but the presence of awareness. Like in chess, the strongest move isn't always the most immediate. The best players sit with the board. They study the tension. They wait. Not because they're afraid to act, but because they know that a rushed move gives away more than it gains. The same is true in life, especially in conflict. When emotions rise and voices swell, most people react. Their instinct is to defend, to explain, to strike back. But silence interrupts that cycle. It gives you a breath, a pause, a space between what triggered you and how you choose to respond. That space is where power lives. It is where impulsive reaction becomes conscious decision. And the more you choose silence not as a retreat, but as a form of restraint, the more others begin to notice something different in you, a kind of quiet authority. They start to weigh their words before speaking to you. They pause before provoking, because over time, they realize that your calm isn't weakness, it's a signal that you are not easily moved, not easily baited, not easily broken. Silence, when wielded with intention, becomes a language, one that speaks of self-control, discernment, and depth. And in a world addicted to noise, that language echoes louder than anything shouted in haste. Socrates understood something few people ever truly grasp. That power in conversation does not belong to the one who speaks the most, but to the one who changes the direction of thought. He didn't confront others with facts or fight to dominate the room. He simply asked questions, small, pointed, disarming. And in doing so, he turned the battlefield of argument into a mirror of self-reflection. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to wake people up. When someone tries to control the conversation, to corner you with certainty, or tower over you with confidence, don't meet them head-on. That's their terrain. Instead, tilt the ground. Ask them something they didn't prepare for. Not a challenge, a disruption. Is that something you've truly experienced? Or something you've been taught to believe? Do you think that's the only perspective worth considering? What do you imagine someone wiser than both of us might see here? These are not just questions. They are cracks in the armor of ego. They force the speaker to slow down, to search, to question themselves in real time. And most of all, they shift the power dynamic, not through confrontation, but through curiosity, because now you're not on the defensive. You're guiding the conversation, gently but firmly, into deeper territory. And when you ask these questions calmly, without tension, without urgency, you signal something important, that you are not there to win, You are there to see, and that kind of presence unsettles those who rely on performance to feel powerful. In that moment, you've done something no loud argument ever could. You've made them pause. You've made them think. And in that pause, the power begins to shift, not with volume, but with vision. There is a reason silence feels like tension, not because of what's happening around us, but because of what begins to stir within us the moment words disappear. Most people don't realize this, but the need to speak quickly, to fill every gap in conversation, to answer before fully thinking, is rarely about communication. It's about control, about fear, about the quiet panic of not knowing what to do with the stillness that reveals us to ourselves. Socrates believed the unexamined life was not worth living, but what he didn't say outright is this: the examined life begins the moment we stop talking, because when we go quiet, we're left with the one person we can never outtalk, ourselves. And that's where the discomfort lives, in that inner voice we've spent years trying to drown beneath the sound of our performance. Most people aren't afraid of silence. They're afraid of what silence brings up. The doubts, the contradictions, the rawness of not knowing who we are without the roles we play. So we rush, we interrupt, we explain ourselves even when no explanation is needed, because deep down we fear what it means to simply be, to sit with a moment that doesn't require us to impress or convince. Socrates didn't just teach others through silence, he held himself in it. He wasn't in a hurry to fill the space, because he understood that the one who needs to talk the most is often the one who fears listening, and the one who fears listening has not yet met the truth inside them. So the next time you feel that rising urgency to speak, pause. Ask yourself, not, what do I want to say, but why do I feel the need to say it? That's where the real clarity begins, not in the words that follow, but in the awareness that precedes them. Socrates never asked questions to win. He asked to uncover, to loosen the grip that certainty had on those who thought they already understood the world. In every dialogue, he chose curiosity over control, not because he lacked opinions, but because he knew that truth does not arrive through answers. It arrives through honest inquiry. Most people ask questions as a form of confirmation. They already know what they want to hear. Their question is just a disguise for a declaration, but Socrates approached it differently. To him, a question was sacred. A question was not a weapon, but a light. It didn't aim to wound, it aimed to reveal. That's why his questions were so disarming. He would listen fully, patiently, without judgment, and then ask something simple, something that seemed harmless at first. But beneath that simplicity was a blade, not to cut, but to separate illusion from understanding. What do you mean by that? How do you know this to be true? These weren't traps. They were invitations to look inward, to step beyond the script and confront the deeper layers beneath our beliefs. And the truth is, we don't ask enough of these questions, not to others and not to ourselves. We react, we assume, we argue, but we rarely inquire, because inquiry requires humility. It requires us to accept that we may not know, that what we've believed for years might need to be re-examined, and that's not easy. But it's where real transformation begins. Socrates wasn't interested in being right. He was interested in being aligned with what is real. And to reach that, you must be willing to stand in silence and let a single question do what no argument ever could: open the door. So ask, not to expose, not to control, but to understand. Ask with patience, ask with presence, because the question that comes from stillness carries more weight than 1,000 rushed conclusions. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And though that line has echoed through centuries, most people misunderstand it. They think it's about constant analysis, dissecting choices, intellectualizing every moment. But what Socrates meant wasn't complexity. He meant honesty. He meant awareness. And awareness begins not with thought, but with silence. Because silence is where the examining begins, not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the kind that strips away distractions, the kind that leaves you alone with yourself. No audience, no performance, just you and what's real. Most avoid that space. They fill it with sound, with scrolling, with small talk, with busy thinking. But the stillness they're avoiding is the doorway to everything they claim to want: clarity, purpose, peace. Socrates believed the examined life was not a luxury for philosophers. It was a responsibility of being human. To live without pausing to ask why, to never reflect, never listen inwardly, is not living. It's drifting. And silence brings us back. It catches us. It invites us to notice what we've ignored in the noise, the questions we've silenced, the truths we've postponed. So when you sit in silence, don't just think of it as a strategy. Think of it as a return to self, a return to the wisdom you've buried under your performance. The examined life begins the moment you stop explaining and start listening, and that is the most Socratic act of all. Silence wins because it cannot be faked. It has no performance, no disguise, no desperate reach for control. In a world addicted to sound, where everyone is broadcasting, explaining, defending, the person who chooses silence becomes something unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar is powerful. People don't know what to do with someone who doesn't rush to respond, who isn't shaped by the pressure to prove. That pause unsettles them, because it invites a different kind of attention, one that isn't trying to impress, but to understand. When you remain silent, you see more. You hear not just the words being said, but the anxiety underneath them, the rehearsed pride, the silent plea for validation. While others try to win the room with noise, you begin to notice what they're not saying, their contradictions, their insecurity, their need. And because you are not competing, you are not distracted. You become the observer, and the observer, over time, becomes the one they look to. Because stillness carries weight in a world constantly trying to prove its own importance. Let them talk. Let them act. Let them spill themselves into the space hoping to dominate it. You stay grounded. You stay still. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand the value of timing. When you finally speak, your words do not echo. They land. Not because they're louder, but because they come from someone who has already seen the room for what it is. That is why silence wins, not because it hides, but because it waits. And when the time comes, it reveals more than any voice ever could. If something in this spoke to you, if the stillness, the patience, the quiet strength of Socrates made something click inside, consider leaving a like. It tells the algorithm that this kind of depth matters. And if you're drawn to these kinds of insights, ancient truths that echo into modern problems, subscribe. This space is for thinkers, feelers, and those who want to live with more clarity, not more noise. I'd love to hear from you too. Was there a moment in your life where silence gave you the advantage? Where not speaking first, or not speaking at all, changed everything? Share it in the comments. You never know who you'll help by doing so. And if this resonated, don't stop here. Watch our video on the Socratic hack, outsmart anyone who talks down to you. It builds on what we explored here, showing how the right question at the right moment can shift the entire dynamic. Until then, stay calm, stay sharp, and let the silence speak for you. It always does.